Hello. One of the festivals of Islam is the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, Mawlid. And with me to tell us about this feast in the Muslim calendar is Dr. Harith bin Ramli. Harith, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us about Mawlid and what it is, when it's celebrated, how it's calculated. But let's start off, what is this feast?
Okay, so essentially, if you can imagine Christmas being celebrated at any point of the year, Christmas carols I would specify. So gatherings where people get together and sing songs about the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. There's an official date of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, which is about the 12th of Rabiul Awal, which is in the Muslim calendar, of course, it's a lunar calendar, so there's no specific time of the year, and that changes in relation to our calendar. So many countries that's actually officially a holiday and people celebrate the Mawlid then. But actually the celebration of the Mawlid is something that can take place at any time, usually during major points of, passage, rite of passage, for example, circumcision, weddings, but sometimes also just as a Thanksgiving ritual. So Muslims gather together and they sing songs about the Prophet, and there's usually food involved as well.
So here we have a festival that is not just moving with the lunar cycle, which for many Westerners is hard enough to concept to grasp, because, well, we're used to the idea that anything that is an annual celebration, it's exactly 365 days between the two dates. But here is a festival that celebrates the Prophet's birthday, but it could be just chosen because today is an important day. It's a day of circumcision, it's a day of something else. And what happens?
Well, usually there are certain texts associated with the Mawlid. So many famous scholars, many of them associated with Sufism, have written lines of poetry detailing the events that took place around the time of Muhammad's birth, the miracles associated with that, and then they go into details, usually about his lineage as well. So this poetry would often be sung in congregation or sometimes by a professional singer while the event is taking place. So for example, there's a ceremony around the time of the birth of a child. There's usually a celebration of that birth, and it's sort of similar to a christening. So the child usually has a bit of their hair cut off. During this celebration, the songs about the Prophet's birth are sung. So in a way, it's kind of reminding people about the kind of...
So you're identifying the birth of this child with the birth of the Prophet.
Absolutely.
And memory acts as the bridge.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but the birth of the Prophet is also, it's seen as a kind of metaphysical event as well by many of the people who celebrate the Mawlid. Prophet isn't just the kind of figure who was born in a period of history. Many Muslims who celebrate the Mawlid also believe that the Prophet was, in a way, the first being ever created, even before Adam. So it's also a celebration of creation as a whole.
And of course, you said that the story of the Prophet's birth, it's linked with miracles and it's linked with genealogy. And of course, for Christians, that's something that they're familiar with from the stories of Jesus.
Absolutely.
There's the story of, there's various genealogies produced of Jesus within a few years of his death. And of course,
showing a prophetic kind of lineage.
Yes, showing that it shows that it fits into a plan. So the same thing is happening in the Muslim celebration of Mawlid. You're actually showing that the birth of the Prophet fits into this larger divine plan.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're sort of celebrating, the kind of mercy of creation, essentially, that God sort of brings everything into being, and the Prophet is described in the Quran specifically as a mercy for all the worlds. So it's a celebration of divine mercy, essentially.
And the interesting thing is that you link this celebration, you said, with singing and with food. And of course, that link of singing and food seems to be, I suspect it's hardwired into our humanity, that celebration goes with food sharing, goes with singing.
Yes.
How hardwired is that in the experience of the average Muslim celebrating this?
Well, it's difficult to say today because they have been many Muslims, many Muslims today might listen to what I'm talking about, the Mawlid, and say, well, this doesn't sound like something we're familiar with when we talk about Islam. And that's because over the last few centuries, there have been several elements we usually associate with the term reformism in Islam. And they looked at the history of the Mawlid, and they said, actually, there's no indication that this is something that the Prophet and the early Muslims did. So this is essentially a religious innovation. And actually, even the people who celebrate Mawlid would probably agree on this, because if you look at the historical evidence, in fact, the first people to have actually officially celebrated the Mawlid in the way that we know it today were Shiites who lived under a dynasty known as the Fatimids. What happens is, interestingly, is the Shiite dynasty, they reigned for a few centuries, and they initiate a lot of kind of holidays associated with the Prophet and also members of his family. But when Sunnis take over, around the time of the Crusades, so we're talking about famous people like Salahuddin, they basically continue these practices as a way to keep the population engaged in devotion to the Prophet. And because for them, the devotion to the Prophet is something, even though the way it's done isn't something associated with the early figures of Islam, it's seen as a necessary practice to fight against the threat of Shiism, or the threat of the Crusaders, for example, or the waning belief of the average Muslim.
Well, it's curious because there's two parallels there, because of course within Christianity in the 17th century, reformers looked at Christmas and they saw that wasn't in the Bible.
Absolutely.
And so of course famously in England, Christmas is abolished.
Yes.
And it, because it's not in the Bible, therefore it's somehow a corrupting influence. But so there's the parallel, this idea that once you get the idea that there was a pure original, you usually tend to start getting rid of things.
Yes.
But there's another interesting thing, and that is that in order for any religion to work, you have to have forms of remembering that are very easy, that are easy in themselves to remember. Like every book, every text is a remembrance, but it's much easier to remember a day. And also, you need to add the spice of joy if memory is to work.
Yes.
No one wants to think back on the miserable days. You know, we forget the miserable days in our existence. We remember the joyous days.
Yes.
So it strikes me that Mawlid seems to touch the human propensity to remember and to remember well, in that it acts, number one, it's picked up in cycles, whether it's the cycles of birth or it's the annual cycle. And also, joyous memories imprint themselves.
Yes, this goes back to your question about whether we're hardwired to enjoy things that are related to singing and food.
Yes, it is.
I think the reason why so many scholars, even though they recognize that this was a religious innovation, they saw it perhaps as a necessary or a good innovation, that if you remove that, you remove the joy out of religiosity as a whole. And this is the problem we're getting in the Muslim world today. There, you know, because partly the combination of reformism and also perhaps the modern pace of life where you don't have time to celebrate saints' days or the Mawlid, you start to see a lot of fun taken out of religion, and all you're left are the kind of command, right or wrong, do this, do that.
And of course the other thing is that I don't know whether this is true of Islamic scholars, but for for Christian academics, this aspect of religion is the part of religion that you can't relate to in terms of a book or a library. And so it seems somehow less dignified.
Yes.
And it's interesting that Christianity has often been incredibly vibrant when it was completely a popular religion and had very little academic input. And yet in other places where you've got a lot of academic input, strangely, it just doesn't seem to bite deeply into people's hearts and lives. Is there a parallel in Islam, or is that purely a Christian thing?
No, I'd say human nature is fairly universal, and you know, I think maybe people find different ways to let religion bite into their lives, and perhaps today it's politics rather than celebrating the birth of the prophets. And you know, there are different ways, I guess, you could relate religion to the popular public. But I'll add to that perhaps that you know, many of the Maoli texts which are used in these ceremonies were written by famous scholars, even legal scholars or theologians. So it almost even sort of ties together the kind of, the learned, the academic side of religion and the popular public, because it allows, the guy who'd normally be writing books of law and delving into questions of theology to kind of really go into something that is happy and familiar to everybody, something that can be celebrated by everyone, from whether or not they're as learned as that person or not. But I think overall there does seem to be something there, which, what you pointed out, which is that, when you take away all this, then there is really, you can't really have religion that would appeal to people unless they were educated, unless they spend a lot of time learning and so on, which might not seem like such a problem today because we have such a, we have public education. But I think there's something missing, we've lost something at the same time.
Well, anyone who wants to speak about God
Yeah.
and wants to remove joy, I think they've missed the boat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps we can leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.